it's very likely most of you have already seen this chart. I'm not going to leave it up for long because there's no way you can get a great look at it, but I wanted to reference it so that you were reminded of it. And if you haven't seen it or would like a closer look at it, I'm very happy to send that to you after the service today. But what it is, what you're looking at is a chart that attempts to make sense of all of the many sources of information that come at us, and to have a sense of both whatever bias they might have and what their reliability might be, because we already know that not all sources of news and information are equal, and it can be a lot for people to try and discern what voices they should be listening to, where they should go for information, and how they should try to make sense of all that's happening in the world around us. And this is one attempt to try and do that. I am not going to try and advocate for it or suggest that it may not have its own bias, but it's an interesting attempt to try and bring some order into the chaos that is the news world in these days. And perhaps you have looked at that closely and come to some conclusions at a prior time to the kind of information that you're gathering and the places where you're going for news about, everything that's swirling around us, from politics to COVID to what's happening on the local front. So it's a hard thing to do in our time, in part because there is so much information, and in part because so many of the voices are very loud, and those actually might be the least helpful voices of all. The question is, what are you giving your time and your attention to these days? Where do you go for information? And then what do you do with that information? Because one of the things I've noticed about the text today is those are two sort of different things. We've heard about Jesus entering a synagogue and beginning to teach. And as soon as he begins to teach, people are startled. And he teaches with authority. So here's a little bit of what that's about. There were lots of people who identified themselves as teachers and offered teachings in synagogues and in other places. One thing for us, it's important for us to remember, is it's not that Jesus was unique in terms of being a teacher and a healer. They were a dime a dozen in the ancient world. But what's unique about Jesus, apparently, is that when he came in, he came in and taught with authority. What folks were used to was someone who would come in and like offer his CV as a reason for you to listen to him. And when he would cite something, he would make sure he identified the 17 dudes behind him who had said the same or similar things, and gather his authority in that way. So there was a very conscious effort by teachers and rabbis at the time to make sure they had plumped up their authority, and that they were teaching on the basis of somebody else's, knowledge and awareness, who's teaching on the basis of some their, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. Teaching at the time was footnoted to death, in the sense that people thought that that's what would make them or give you a reason to listen to them. That was the standard of the time. And here comes Jesus, who isn't like, okay, here are the 17 people I've learned from, and here's how I've gathered all of this preceding information, and now I'm going to teach you. Jesus taught as one who had authority in and of himself. Jesus taught as one not who was dependent on all these other sources of authority, dependent on other sources of authority, and dependent on other. Jesus taught as one who had authority. And it was startling, to say the least. So startling that it's mentioned both at the start and the end of this interaction here in the synagogue. Because as soon as they've noticed that he's teaching with authority and kind of being intrigued by that, he commands a demon to be silent, and the demon listens to him. And so at the end of this text, we hear them say, not only does he teach with authority, the demons obey him. Notice, though, that none of the people sort of being astonished by this or kind of sensing Jesus' authority or hearing him necessarily respond and turn their lives over to that authority. And the text goes on to say that his fame or his renown grew. But again, that's not exactly the same thing as people submitting to that authority. And it strikes me that recognizing authority and then living under that authority, those are two different things. Think about it this way. Most of us recognize the medical community's expertise and authority in terms of the instructions and advice and guidance they provide in terms of things like diet and smoking, or the need to move and exercise and have certain tests at a regular intervals. I mean, I suppose somewhere there's someone wandering around still advocating for smoking as being beneficial to your health. But most of us know it's like not an A++ thing to do in terms of advancing our breathing. That doesn't mean people don't smoke. And people who are smoking aren't confused about its health benefits or lack thereof. It's not that they don't recognize the authority and the expertise of those who advise against it. It's that they haven't molded their life to it. And, very few of us believe that either our waistlines or our heart are helped by bacon and donuts. But people still eat bacon and donuts. Right? So there's the ability to see expertise and authority. And then there's also responding to it. So there's recognizing it and there's responding to it. And those are two different things. There's all kinds of ways that plays out in the world. And I think we see a bit of that in the text this morning in terms of those who are astonished at Jesus' authority. But they don't all then go, okay, now I need to turn my life around and change my life and live differently. Of course, we very often sort of do the same thing. I hope that we acknowledge and recognize the divine authority that is present in all of creation, including our own lives and selves. And I hope we even long to live in the reign of God. But, we don't wake up every day and do it just as we should. There are ways that we resist the authority that is present in the reign of God. The word for authority here, in fact, in the text is a word that is very often applied to kings, but it's also strongly connected to the kind of authority that God is expected to have in the reign of God. That when God's reign comes, this would be the kind of authority that would be present in that reign in terms of the influence that God would have and the way that we would submit. And I think sometimes we're kind of okay with the fact that it's that reign of God is a little bit off because we have stuff we want to do first before we necessarily submit to the reign of God. You know, we're not quite ready to live under the authority of God. We get what's good about it, and we understand that there are things in our lives that are either not good for us or maybe good for us but not for others. You know, like maybe they're to our advantage, but it's not really a fair way to live when you take into account the needs of those who are poor or marginalized or you know, less able than we. And so we would like to live in a world where things are good for everyone, but we're not kind of quite ready to give up our privilege or our position. We'd like to live in a world where everybody had something to eat, but we're not quite sure we're exactly yet ready to share. It's in that space. It's in that space that we are at risk for recognizing God's authority, but not responding to it. For recognizing God's purpose and intent, but not yet shaping ourselves and our own lives to live in the midst of it. We're sort of signed up, but we're glad that there's a wait list, because then we can kind of keep doing what we're doing for just a bit longer. It's not that we intend for it to be ever, but maybe just a bit longer. What are the ways you might manage to do both in your life? To live not only recognizing God's authority in your life, to live not only recognizing Christ's authority in your life, but also to respond to it, to remold and reshape and remake those parts of your heart and your spirit that aren't quite in accord with the intended reign of God. All of us could probably do a bit more to react and respond to God's purpose and intent for our lives and for the lives of all people. And that really maybe is the biggest place of opportunity for us when we think about that, is to contemplate how we might be as concerned for others as we are for ourselves, to contemplate prioritizing the needs of others in the same way we prioritize the needs of ourselves and those, you know, we kind of count us on our team. That is not really easy to do. And to do so probably requires us to not just recognize the authority of God and not even just respond to the authority of God, but actually submit to the authority of God. And that is, that's the tough one, right? That whole submit thing. Because we don't live in a culture here as Americans that thinks submission is very cool. We are very often not fans. Which is how we end up in a world where so many people are reality challenged and are listening to information and finding resources that agree with the version of reality they'd like to exist. We have seen that in a way this last almost year. Gosh, we are almost at a year of all of this COVID stuff. And there are people still not wearing masks, right? Or acting as if none of this is going on. But in some states where that's particularly strong, that kind of willingness and insistence on creating a reality that you want rather than the one that actually exists, that's sort of being reality challenged. That is at its core an unwillingness to submit to what is, and insisting that you get to create the world that you want. We've seen just how dangerous a thing that is. And in ways, again, it's an illustration nobody would have wanted, but that will serve us for the rest of our preaching lives. Those of us who do this, that there are those who will not submit to the reign of God or to reality. And so that means that you and I, as people who are working to be faithful to God, have to shape and form ourselves all the more to become those who recognize God's authority, who respond to God's authority, and who, at the end of the day, submit to God's authority. Trusting that this work that God is engaged in and enabling, this work that is unfolding, is in fact the reign of God, and will in fact bring us into an experience of joy and love and goodness that is unlike anything we could have created ourselves. And that the thing that is really wonderful about the opportunity for all people to be well served by the world we're creating is something that we ought to want for. And until we naturally want for it, we need to submit to God's call for such a purpose in our midst. We too, like those who first saw Jesus, can recognize his authority. But what I want to invite you to do today is to think about how you might respond to his authority and how you might change some things in your life so that it lived in accord with the call that God has placed on your life, so that you might get to participate in all that God is doing. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.